All right, so are you ready to dive into something you think you know, but probably has you fooled?
Okay, I'm intrigued. Hit me with it.
It's English language teaching, ELT.
ELT.
Like teaching English as a second language, that
Yeah,
kind of thing.
I get it. Yeah.
But trust me on this, it gets way more interesting, uh, more global, and way more complicated than you might think.
Really. More than just like grammar rules and vocabulary.
Oh, way more. I was geeking out just reading this intro to it's this academic text called W1 Intro.
Okay.
And right off the bat, it says that this whole thing, English as a foreign language, is kind of outdated.
Outdated, huh? How so?
Well, in a world with all these world Englishes, like, who are the native speakers even anymore?
Yeah, that's a good point. I've definitely noticed that too.
Makes you think, right?
It really does. This idea of world Englishes is so key in how we understand English today.
Totally.
The source really emphasizes this. Basically, English isn't just this one thing, owned by a few countries. It's constantly changing, evolving,
Oh.
and it's shaped by everyone who speaks it.
Exactly. Like, you can totally tell the difference between someone speaking British English, American
Yeah.
English, Australian English.
Oh, for sure.
They're all English, but like with their own little twists.
Absolutely. And this goes way beyond just accents, too.
Oh, yeah. In what ways?
Well, it changes how we think about, like, accents in general, what we consider correct grammar,
Mm-hmm.
even who gets to decide what's right or wrong in the language, who's an authority.
Oh, wow. I never thought about it that way.
It's interesting stuff. And this is where it gets really, really interesting because it's not just about linguistics anymore. It's about power dynamics.
Okay, see, now we're getting to the really good stuff.
Right.
Now, the source also mentioned this term, linguistic imperialism.
Yeah.
And to be honest, that sounds kind of intimidating.
Yeah. It's definitely a hot topic, that's for sure. But
Yeah.
basically, it looks at how the spread of a language, in this case, English,
Okay.
how that connects to political and economic power, dominance.
I see.
Because, think about it. The language we speak, it often determines who has access to things like education, jobs,
Yeah, true.
even political power. It's a big deal.
Yeah, I never really connected it like that before. That's interesting. So you're saying even something as simple as picking out a textbook, like an English textbook, they can have these bigger implications because of this linguistic imperialism idea.
Exactly. Because even the language that they use in the textbooks,
Right.
the way that pronunciation is taught,
Uh-huh.
even just the activities that teachers use in the classroom,
Wow.
they can reflect, certain cultural values, certain biases.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that language is never really neutral. It's always connected to these bigger power systems,
Yeah. That's definitely blown my mind thinking about this stuff. Speaking of classrooms, I thought it was really fascinating
Yeah.
that the source talked a lot about the learners themselves.
Okay.
Like, not just the teaching methods, but like the actual people who are trying to learn English.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah, like understanding the people behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's two main approaches to understand how people learn languages
Okay.
that the source talks about. So there's the cognitive side, what's happening up in the brain.
Right.
But then there's the sociocultural side, which looks at how our environment, our background, how that shapes how we learn.
Interesting. So like as an English language teacher,
Yeah.
it's not just about like knowing grammar perfectly.
Right.
It's about understanding where these students are coming from,
Yes.
what their goals are,
Yeah.
what might be like helping them or maybe even holding them back in their learning.
Exactly. Imagine you have two students, both beginners.
Okay.
One's like a young professional,
Right.
needs English for business meetings.
Okay. Yeah.
And the other one, let's say, is a recent immigrant, trying to like just live life in a new country.
All right.
Both learning English,
Sure.
but completely different needs, different motivations. Even the way they learn will probably be totally different, you see.
That's such a good point.
Yeah.
Because you're not just teaching the language itself.
Yeah.
You're teaching a person.
Exactly.
And they have this whole history, culture, and their own unique goals.
Yeah, 100%. And this idea of English for specific purposes is huge in ELT. It's massive.
Really?
Yeah, like teaching English to engineers is going to be completely different to teaching it to, let's say, doctors or lawyers.
Oh, yeah, of course.
It needs to be tailored, right? The way you teach it needs to match their specific needs, way they're going to use it.
That makes a lot of sense. Wow. Okay, you have officially blown my mind wide open. Who knew ELT was this deep and thought-provoking?
I know, right?
And we're just getting started. All right, so we're back, and we're going deeper into the ELT world. We talked about world Englishes, the power dynamics, all that. But what about actually teaching it? Like, what's going on in these classrooms?
Well, this is where the source really gets into the nitty-gritty of teaching methods.
Right.
It even suggests we might be in, get this, a post-method era, whatever that means.
Post-method era. Sounds kind of intense. Does that mean, like, teachers are just winging it now? No more lesson plans?
Not exactly. It's more about recognizing that there's no one best method that works for everyone everywhere. For ages, ELT was all about finding that magic formula, you know?
Right, like everyone's trying to crack the code.
Exactly, and they'd test out all these different methods like they were competing brands or something.
Oh, yeah, like that one method I remember learning about where it's just drilling verb conjugations till they're stuck in your head.
Yeah.
Like effective, but not exactly a party, you know?
Exactly. And the field's moved away from that rigid approach. Researchers are realizing language learning is way more complex than just memorizing rules.
Like, sense it's about actually using the language, right?
Exactly. Communication, interaction, adapting on the fly, that's the good stuff.
So if there's no one right way, what are some big ideas in ELT classrooms these days? I saw the source mentioning things like communicative language teaching and task-based learning, whatever those are.
Ah, those are two of the biggies. So communicative language teaching, or CLT for short, it's all about real-world fluency.
Okay, so less textbook, more real talk.
Exactly. Giving students the tools to actually use English, not just analyze it. Think role-playing, discussions, things you'd actually do with English out in the world.
Oh, that's cool. I learned way better by doing, not just memorizing. So I bet that holds true for language, too.
Absolutely. And that's where task-based learning fits in. It's about designing activities that are meaningful, you know? Learners use the language to achieve something specific, like planning a trip together or solving a problem.
Because it's active, it's engaging. It's not just passively taking in information.
Exactly. It's about making those connections, understanding what motivates learners, giving them a chance to actually use the language for something they care about.
We keep coming back to that theme. Who knew ELT was so student-centered?
It really is. And this goes beyond the classroom, too. The source talks about learner autonomy, basically giving students the tools and skills to keep learning even when they're not in class.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
You don't become fluent just by showing up twice a week,
Yeah.
right? You got to live it, find ways to make it part of your life outside those classroom walls.
Exactly. And in our digital world, learners have so many resources at their fingertips. Language exchange apps, online communities, it's amazing.
Yeah, that's so true. The internet opens up so many doors for language learning.
Oh.
So much to think about. And speaking of which, the source also mentioned teaching English to younger learners.
Oh, yeah.
And I imagine that comes with a whole other set of considerations, right?
Oh, absolutely. You can't just take materials designed for adults and shrink them down. Young learners, they thrive on play, songs, stories. They bring this whole different energy.
That reminds me of that saying, play is a child's work. Learning through games and activities sounds way more fun than just memorizing verbs, that's for sure.
Right. Plus, you have to consider things like testing and assessment and the impact that can have on a child's development. Their relationship with language is still forming, you know.
Yeah, those are really good points. It's serious stuff when you're shaping a child's relationship with language like that.
Right.
Which makes me think there's also the bigger question of why English at all at such a young age?
Right.
Is it to give them a head start in a globalized world? Is it about cultural influence? Or are there concerns about, like, preserving a local language alongside that?
It's a big debate for sure.
Yeah, lots of political and social stuff tied into that.
Absolutely. And that actually ties into this really fascinating concept that the source mentions called complexity theory.
Oh, we're getting complex now. I like it. Okay, so what's complexity theory all about?
Basically, it's a way of looking at the classroom as its own little ecosystem. The teacher, the students, the materials, the environment, everything is kind of bumping into each other, influencing everything else, often in ways you can't predict.
So, like, one tiny change can have this ripple effect throughout the whole classroom.
Exactly. It's
Right.
like that butterfly effect idea. And that's why the source stresses that teachers can't just be instructors, they have to be researchers and observers too.
Oh, interesting.
Constantly reflecting on their teaching, seeing what's working, what's not, and adapting based on the unique dynamics of that particular group of people.
So it's way more dynamic than just following a textbook. It's about being flexible and responsive, constantly learning yourself as you go.
Exactly. And believe it or not, we haven't even touched on technology in the classroom, the whole debate around English-only policies, or the importance of addressing learners' values and beliefs. There's just so much to unpack here.
Wow, you weren't kidding. That is a lot. We've covered so much ground, and it sounds like we've only just scratched the surface.
All right, deep divers, we're back. We've gone deep on world Englishes, the power dynamics, all that good stuff. But for this final part, let's get into the nitty-gritty. What's actually happening in these ELT classrooms?
Well, it's easy to think of language learning as this solo mission, right? But this source, it really digs into the importance of what it calls classroom talk.
Classroom talk. Okay, so not just the teacher lecturing at the chalkboard, but how everyone's interacting, learning from each other.
Exactly. It's about creating that space where learners actually feel okay with experimenting, making those inevitable mistakes.
Well, tell me about it.
But learning from those mistakes, all in this supportive environment. The teacher isn't just the sage on the stage, they're like the guide on the side, facilitating this whole dynamic process.
Makes me wonder how good ELT teachers handle those mistakes without, like, crushing a student's confidence. The source actually uses the term errors, which sounds kind of harsh when I think about my own language learning fails.
It's a tough one for sure. You want fluency, confidence, but also accuracy does matter. And the source really digs into the research here, all these different ways teachers can give feedback that actually helps without being a downer.
So is it better to correct every little slip up or just let things flow so you don't interrupt the conversation? Asking for a friend who may have mangled a few tenses in her day.
Haha, I hear you. It honestly depends. Sometimes a little rephrase does the trick. Sometimes you got to go full grammar explanation. It's about being selective. Target the errors that are truly hurting communication, not nitpick every little thing.
That makes me think back to my own classes, like constant corrections that just made me too scared to speak. But being totally lost in a conversation, that's no good either. Finding that sweet spot is key.
It's an art, truly, and that's where the teacher skill comes in. No easy answers. It's about reading the room, understanding the learners, adapting on the fly.
Adapting, that's the key. Which reminds me of this whole English-only classroom debate. Is it really better to, like, totally ban a student's first language?
Yeah.
Seems counterintuitive, like you're taking away a tool they could use.
Yeah, the source points out this huge disconnect between the ideal English-only thing you see in textbooks versus the reality of diverse classrooms. Learners, they naturally use their first language, especially when they're starting out.
Right, it's like you can't just erase someone's entire linguistic history. That's part of who they are.
100%. The source actually talks about the principled use of the learner's own language. There are times when bringing in those native languages is smarter, more effective, more inclusive.
It's valuing what those languages bring, not treating them like the enemy. And of course, so many other factors play a role, right? Class size, resources, even just the physical space. I was really struck by the part on teaching large classes in difficult circumstances. That's the reality for a lot of teachers out there.
It's huge, and it highlights how much creativity, flexibility, deep understanding of the learner's needs, all of that comes into play, especially within those constraints.
And hey, we can't forget about the tablet in the backpack, so to speak. Technology is changing everything about how languages are taught and learned these days.
Oh, for sure. The source gets into some fascinating stuff about like online communication and how that impacts language acquisition. For example, did you know online writing feedback can actually be really effective? More detailed, personalized than what a teacher can always do in person?
That's wild. So it's not about replacing teachers. It's about tech giving them superpowers, essentially.
Exactly. And as we wrap up our deep dive into ELT, that's what I keep coming back to. It's about so much more than just those grammar rules and vocab lists. It's people, it's culture, it's how we connect in an increasingly globalized world.
You've seriously changed how I look at those language textbooks. Walking away with a whole new appreciation for how complex and how important ELT really is.
That's what we're here for. Taking those topics we think we know and revealing the hidden depths.
Love it. So listeners, next time you encounter another language, whether it's in a classroom, online, wherever, take a second to really listen. You might be surprised what you pick up. Till next time, keep those questions coming because there's always more to explore right here on The Deep Dive.